Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Ground, reading the Book of Dust by Philip Pullman. This will be the first in a series of side quests into the companion books that were released between the end of his Dark Materials and the start of the Book of Dust. I'm calling this episode the Globetrotter series of maps for the traveler, or It Feels as If the Whole City's Looking Out for Us. It's about Lyra's Oxford, released in 2003. There are many great quotes in this book that would serve as titles. It's a book about the telling of stories and the interpretation of stories. And this also happens to be around the time when Pullman is giving a lot of talks and writing a lot of the essays that will be collected in Demon Voices. There is a great wealth of material available: videos, conversations, transcripts, uh, podcasts. And I'm starting to feel a bit overwhelmed myself, actually, with this superabundance of material out there. I also have just been reading and really enjoying Kristen Poole's recent book, Philip Pullman and the Historical Imagination, which focuses on his connections to 17th century authors and ideas. And so I'm really hoping that I can find a way to interview her in a future conversation. Um, in particular, there is a video on Oxford University's website as well as hosted on YouTube, I think. Anyhow, that comprises a talk that Pullman gave right around the release of this book, Lyra's Oxford. And he's in conversation with Margaret Keane, a scholar there, as well as some of the people who worked on the book with him, primarily his editor, David Fickling, and one of the designers of the uh, of the book, Heidi Lightfoot, I want to say. I could be getting the name wrong. I think it's Heidi Lightfoot. And I believe that John Lawrence, the illustrator, is also there, although the voices are a bit difficult to make out at parts. So here's the book, my copy of it anyhow. I think it's the first edition. It has this beautiful red binding with a kind of texture to it, cloth. You can feel it. You can even kind of see it, the way it creates a bit of shine. It almost sparkles, and there's these little shadows in the stippling of the light on its surface. It's the perfect book in a way. It's the perfect size and shape for a story of this kind. It's lovely to hold and look at. The illustrations are engravings, and they're very beautiful. Most are black and white, although there is some color in sections of the map and, of course, the cover as well. I think Pullman mentions that he would have liked to be able to tint some of the pictures, but there's a later edition I've seen images of, at least by with illustrations by another artist, Chris Wormel, and those are color and are quite beautiful in their own right. On the back cover, as I'm looking at it, uh, I can get distracted by the cost of the book. £9 99 pence. When I got this, I must have ordered it online because I wasn't in the UK. But it's a picture of the island of England, and it's got in Wales, and it's got a kind of grid, but it's not a very um, mathematical grid. It's not a very regular grid, that is. It distinguishes Oxford and London with little scroll effect, and the blurb is really nice. A beguiling new episode from the universe of his dark materials and other matter never before seen in this world. So the connection with his dark materials is right there in front of us. It's on the front cover as well, and the the engravings are are accompanied, as it mentions, with other materials, other objects. Now, this is another part of what makes this such an interesting book to talk about, and gives us so much to go on, because in addition to the text itself, we have these illustrations, these realia, a kind of multimedia experience, really. And that's fascinating to me, because this whole project initially of commenting on and analyzing and thinking about the context of Philip Pullman's books began with an idea that I had to one day, and I maybe still will, try to create a kind of video game adaptation of the story. And so anything that is in the direction of that, old computer games and video games would come with a kind of smattering of objects, including the instruction booklet, which were in a way meant to be integrated into the game itself. One example I can think of off the top of my head, I didn't have a lot of computer games, but I did have a Nintendo Entertainment System, an NES, and there was a game called Star Tropics, where you get to a certain point, you have to input a code, and you can get the code by looking in the instruction booklet. Now, I got the game secondhand, and I didn't have the instruction booklet, and so I was stuck, because I don't think there was really a lot out on the internet in those days, and I didn't have access to it at any rate. Um, so, uh, this also might raise a question, with such a short story, what is it that we are paying for here, really, that with that £9, 99 pence? Uh, is this a bit of a cynical cash grab, one might say, on Pullman's part? And I certainly paid more than that for this signed edition. Well, I don't mind that so much, because I recognize the mercenary nature of writing and publishing, and I recognize that that is a part of a bigger uh, and a much richer experience than one that can be computed in pounds and pence. I know that other people might disagree, and I certainly think that in the case of some of the books that are among these companion volumes, particularly The Imagination Chamber, which I don't actually own yet, there is an element of the cash grab, perhaps. But we'll come to that in turn. Um, these books are certainly a way of Pullman reintegrating, reconnecting with the worlds of his story. He talks about in many places how he thought he was done telling Lyra's story, but then found that he had more to say. And part of that is, again, the publisher, David Fickling, his editor as well, coming to him and requesting that they create a little something. He calls it a bonbon, a little goodie, in his talk. And it sort of began with this idea of a map. Could we have this map, and then the story that goes with it, and then a few other objects sort of agglomerate on there as well. And we'll look at each in turn. I feel like this is an important piece to bear in mind, that we might not have what is now the Book of Dust without the intermediation and the process of writing these shorter, slighter, perhaps less important companion books, these little books as he calls them. And I find that fascinating. I think that this little book is one which fulfilled a certain kind of dream for me and for many readers of getting more of the story, more time, more images. Um, it's the dream also of a book which is its own interpretation in a way, a book which teaches how it is to be understood, and that teaches us in a language that we already somehow know. Again, the narrator is very close to the narrator of His Dark Materials, and yet somehow different. And that process will continue, that process of change and transformation into the narrators of each of the books in the Book of Dust. I find also that this is a story particularly whose meaning is inseparable from its form. The form being a kind of novella or short story, um, but something very close to a tone poem in places as well. And this starts with the epigraph, which is a kind of poem in prose. Here it is. Ellipses. Oxford, where the real and the unreal jostle in the streets, where North Parade is in the south and South Parade is in the north, where paradise is lost under a pumping station, where the river mists have a solvent and vivifying effect on the stone of the ancient buildings, so that the gargoyles of Magdalen College climb down at night and fight with those from Wycombe, or fish under the bridges, or simply change their expressions overnight. Oxford, where windows open into other worlds. And it goes on. This is attributed to Oscar Baedeker in a book called The Coasts of Bohemia. And it has a footnote. After that pumping station, there's a semicolon, but the footnote says, the old houses of Paradise Square were demolished in order to make an office block, in fact, not a pumping station. But Baedeker, for all his wayward charm, is a notoriously unreliable guide, partly because he, of course, does not exist. And as Pullman points out in his talk at Oxford, uh, he actually steals some portion of this, maybe adjusts it a little bit, from one of his own published essays in the Guardian paper. So there is, of course, a Baedeker who wrote travel books, but his name was Carl Baedeker, and his style, I think, is a bit different from this. Although I haven't actually been able to read any of the originals, my sense is that we have a voice here that is rather close to Pullman himself. There's online a copy of a rare Baedeker reprint of the 1913 edition of the Austria edition in his travel volumes. It is a special edition facsimile reprinting of the 29th edition that was published in 1913. It includes Bohemia, Galicia, Dalmatia, Bosnia, Hungary, Siebenbürgen, a region in Romania, now mainly Transylvania, Cetinje, Belgrade, and Bucharest. It serves as a provisional addition to the new edition of Austrich, a revised edition of the secession states becomes available, issued in 1926. So that's a bit of the blurb from that book. So that is something I found because I was searching to see if there's one about Bohemia. This phrase, the coasts of Bohemia, is apparently taken, though, from the allusion to Shakespeare's late play, A Winter's Tale, which I had forgotten, but it is actually one of my favorites. And one of my favorite things about it is this mystery of the setting. It's almost put into the reader, the audience's face. There are exchanges between the mariner and I believe it's the king, as they're talking about landing on the shore of a famously landlocked and also famously ambiguous place, Bohemia. So to call Oscar Baedeker an unreliable guide is a bit of an understatement, we could say. And the interesting thing here is that as a narrator, Pullman is always careful to maintain a certain distance between himself and the voice of his storytellers. But at the same time, he very much identifies himself as a storyteller. And in most cases, what he considers good writing, and his own writing certainly falls into that category, is a narrator who becomes transparent, who becomes almost invisible to the reader. They are able to ape reliability, convincingness, sincerity, so much that they become almost Shakespearean uh, in their evanescence, their disappearance. They're very difficult to pin down. And yet, another great question in his mind, always when it comes to writing, is the identity of this narrator. He loves to call this the great character in all literature. And um, when asked which character he is most like in his stories, he says he's most like the narrator. Um, this is also a plot point in a way, um, and certainly a point about the theme of the Book of Dust, because one of those series of seemingly small events that drives a wedge between Lyra and her demon, Pan, is related in the Secret Commonwealth, I think, the clumsy error of confusing author and narrator, and Lyra's um, picking up on that and degrading the other student who made it. This is going to be trotted out somewhere along in the story as she reviews those steps in her estrangement from Pantalaimon. And I will say that in this epigraph, we have an unusual degree of showiness, of self-consciousness on display. Um, the comment in the footnote on the writing itself is quite unusual, but not without precedent, because in some of his epigraphs, I think it's in Count Karlstein, Pullman actually brings in a bit of the text from the story itself to be the epigraph for a subsequent chapter in the story. And he's very pleased with himself with that bit of meta conjuring. The Paradise parking lot cited here is also mentioned in a talk that he gives at St. Barnabas Church. Um, the gargoyles are uh, possibly inspired by a contest that was run by Oxford libraries, I think, called Millennium Myths and Monsters. And there's a brief address that he gives, um, stitched together with some comments from the kids, the school kids who won the contest, designing new gargoyles to replace some of the ones that were crumbling. Um, of course, these other worlds, whether literal or poetical, are core to his whole project of world building and storytelling. And again, that article that he's quoting from appears in The Guardian in 2002, so something like a year before this is published, probably around the time he's writing this. And he feels free to crib from himself. He loves stealing from any source. Then we get the well, it's not named exactly what this is, a kind of preface or foreword in which he says that this book contains a story and several other things. The other things might be connected with the story, or they might not. They might be connected to stories that haven't appeared yet. It's not easy to tell. It's easy to imagine how they might have turned up, though. And then he gives a list of some of these things, and what happens to them is that they might have come through a, a window to another world. Um, he compares them to the traces left by an ionizing particle in a bubble chamber. They draw the line of a path taken by something too mysterious to see. That path is a story, of course. And then he alludes to his scientist, Dr. Mary Malone, and one of the objects is a postcard that she has written, of course. Actually, all of these objects that he lists, in some way or another, could be seen as pertaining to this story or other stories in his world. Let's look at the list. Old postcards. So certainly we have that at the end of this one. Theater programs. His books are adapted into theater plays, and he himself adapted other writers' stories into plays when he was writing plays for his students at the middle schools where he worked. We have leaflets about bomb-proofing your cellar. That one's a bit tougher, but it certainly is a part of his own story insofar as his parents' generation, his grandparents' generation would have lived through that um, that era of British history, which he talks about as being kind of the tail end of British Empire, and the nostalgia for that, the hangover from that, if you like, of people of his own generation not being quite ready to let go of that idea of empire, outmoded though it was. Um, that also, of course, is the impetus for a story like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The children are taken out to the country to escape from the bombing of the cities. Greeting cards, photograph albums, holiday brochures. Again, those all have a kind of family resemblance to them. Instruction booklets for machine tools, maps, catalogs, railway timetables, menu cards from long gone cruise liners. All kinds of things that once served a real and useful purpose but have now become cut adrift from the things and the people they relate to. Well, that group of them is going to be the particle that creates the story here when he observes it. That mention of being cut adrift connects with the problem of severance or being cut apart from one's demon. It was, again, very early in his Dark Materials, uh, becoming a central concern, and once again in the Book of Dust is going to be a core issue. Um, Now, the chamber of which he um, sketches the path in is a lot like the uh, imagination chamber where his lantern slides are collected and released. Um, I think that the idea of science as a kind of storytelling is one that he also talks about in the preface or foreword to that book, and so we'll be revisiting it there. It's also an image that he alludes to in a number of talks and essays, um, particularly in the writing of stories, again in The Path Through the Wood. This image of uh, science and storytelling is usually connected with the figure of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He talks about how he would go to scientific lectures to renew his stock of metaphors, and that idea of a phase space is a particular metaphor that Pullman appeals to in his discussion of how he writes and how he thinks storytelling happens. Um, the phase space is the notional space that contains not just the actual consequences of the present moment, but all the possible consequences, the game of noughts and crosses, he also calls it. I think we call that one tic-tac-toe. He also connects this with the poet Robert Frost and his poem with the two roads that diverged in a yellow wood and taking the path less traveled by. He gives the example of Jane Austen writing the opening lines of Anna Karenina, two famous opening lines that could have overlapped in some way, that could branch into any possible direction, really. And so that's where I think his ideas of fantasy and science fiction versus realism are most interesting and most on target. They're least interesting where he's simply degrading fantasy. They're most interesting where he has this idea of possibilities that are, in a way, infinite, and that it's the job of the scientist as well as the storyteller to select from among them the most plausible, the most powerful, the most evocative, according to their purposes. Um, the mention of Coleridge also draws me back into that world of the Inklings, not in Lewis this time, but in the person of Owen Barfield, who was keenly interested in the process of the development of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, the process of our awareness cluing us into deeper meanings behind the world of nature, the world of language, the world of stories and myths. And again, this is a powerful, uh, although short, perhaps more effective for that, evocation of that process that we get in the story that follows. We see Lyra's awareness of herself being part of a kind of story and the way in which she is learning to read that story. At the end of this, he says, perhaps some particles move backwards in time. Perhaps the future affects the past in some way we don't understand. Or perhaps the universe is simply more aware than we are. There are many things we haven't yet learned how to read. The story in this book is partly about that very process. So, again, the criticism could be leveled that this is too on the nose, that this is spelling out a bit too much of what is meant to happen in that Keatsian space of negative capability. Um, but Pullman insists that he never writes according to a theme. He discovers the theme through his writing. He writes according to certain images, these metaphors from science, from poems, from his experience in the world, his memories and conversations, and so on. And so the dominant image here is of these birds. And he tells about how that image came to him as he was watching the birds in his own neighborhood. The story is called Lyra and the Birds. So that word birds is right there in the place of Lyra and her demon, the opening phrase, that significant phrase that situates us with this character as the one that we are rooting for, the one we are connected to, the protagonist. For all her flaws, someone that we want to spend time with. And so the question arises, what is the nature of Lyra's connection to these birds? And implicit in that, of course, is the mysterious nature of this best idea he ever had of the connection of one to one's demon. So the first thing that we notice is that birds are plural, demon is singular, and perhaps that helps inspire or is connected with Pullman's ideas about a kind of plurality of demons that we see with the fairy queen Diania in La Belle Sauvage. A very mysterious, although brief, section of that story deals with this person, although maybe not a human person, who has not one but a kind of cloud or collection of demons in the form of a cluster of butterflies. So the connections come thick and fast here. The opening sentence, Lyra didn't often climb out of her bedroom window these days. She had a better way onto the roof of Jordan College. The porter had given her a key that led her onto the roof of the lodge tower. So this connects us with the very beginning of the Golden Compass, Northern Lights, where we see Lyra scampering across the rooftops with her friend Roger the kitchen boy. It connects us with the very end of the Amber Spyglass, where we see how far she has come from that child. In many ways, she has her own key to the garden, and she can go and sit and meditate and listen to the birds there. So now we have a kind of combination of those things, and of course there's a bit of irony there about not going out the window, because of course one thing that we learn at the end of the Amber Spyglass is that all the gates or windows or doors or openings between the worlds must be closed, and that it's the job of everyone to live in the place where they are rather than yearn for some other world where they might go. This is modified in the Book of Dust in ways that I don't find, at least at this stage of my rereadings, entirely satisfying or coherent. But there we are. She's on the roof, but she's found another way out there. And this better way involves a responsibility. So she now, again, has to learn to read the alethiometer through being responsible and through dutifully and diligently reading books. Well, in the same way, now she climbs on the roofs not to run about and get into trouble, but to check on the stability of the stonework up there. Again, there's that contest to um, create some new gargoyles for the crumbling stonework at his old college, Exeter in Oxford. Um, so the bursar is mentioned here as well. She would give the report to the porter, and he would pass it on to the bursar. And in exchange, she gets to go out on the roof. So that lead on the stonework also brings to mind the battle between Will and the thief, um, Paulo, and Angelica's brother. What was his name? Anyway, uh, when they fight and the knife sinks like butter into the lead. Um, so I think that Will is also on her mind here, in a way that again he really isn't very much in the subsequent books in the Book of Dust. Um, he's certainly on the reader's mind. When Pullman talks about his project with these companion books, these little books, he always alludes to a little green book, which is going to be about Will. So far, this book has not appeared, and for all we know, hasn't been written. But there might be notes out there somewhere. Um, Again, we might think back to uh, Lyra's story of the rook that she and Roger found. And she tells this story in two different ways in quick succession. Um, or rather, the narrator tells one version of the story and she tells another. How they talked about nursing it back to health, how they talked about roasting and eating it. I don't know that we ever find out the true version of that story. So she's up there, invisible except from the sky. So the idea of a republic of heaven being something that we create where we are is in strong tension with the root meaning of that word heaven, which is simply sky or skies, plural. And the way that that word is used, say, in the Lord's Prayer. The idea that someone might be watching Lyra from above doesn't really occur to her, but it certainly occurs to us because it's us. We're the ones reading, and the narrator, of course, as well, the one conjuring this world. In much the same way, we are subject to emanations, particles, dust that seems to come from the sky, but its true source is in our awareness and our consciousness. In the time that she spends up there, she is studying those books of hers that she's borrowed from the library. She's trying to coax a stork family to come over to her tower from across the way at St. Michael's. She tries building a platform for them and wants to lure them using food. They talk about whether they might eat fish or frogs. I think that the images there, make us think of the wounded rook. They make us think of the birds in the amber spyglass, those awful tualapi birds with the white sail feathers. But I think that they also conjure here with the fish and the frogs key images, very understated. For Tony Macarios clutching the dried fish, I always think back to that. Fish being an early symbol for Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ, in the early church. The frogs are kind of amphibious. They're both a water and a land creature, just like the Egyptians, those denizens of the marshes. And also, like this very important phrase from the Secret Commonwealth, that of going by water and by land, aqua terraque. So again, whether the germ of that idea is somehow present here, or whether this is just evocative imagery to think about. Pullman also mentions that he and one of his sons were working on a private language, which was frog. That's always delighted me. So then we come to the birds. The starlings that Pullman was inspired by, he writes into his story here. So though she's up there looking around, reading a bit, enjoying the sunshine, she was waiting for the starlings. That year an extraordinary number of them had come to roost in the Botanic Garden, and every evening they would rise out of the trees like smoke, and swirl and swoop and dart through the skies above the city in their thousands. Millions, Pan said. Maybe, easily. I don't know who could ever count them. There they are. They didn't seem like individual birds, or even individual dots of black against the blue. It was the flock itself that was the individual. It was like a single piece of cloth, cut in a very complicated way, that let it swing through itself and double over and stretch and fold in 3 dimensions without ever tangling, turning itself inside out and elegantly waving and crossing through and falling and rising and falling again. If it was saying something, said Lyra, like signaling, no one would ever know, though no one could ever understand what it means. Maybe it means nothing, it just is. Everything means something, Lyra said severely. We just have to find out how to read it. This is the core of this story, and I think of storytelling, or Pullman's theory of it anyhow, and of reading and interpretation. The idea that everything means something is a direct rebuttal, contrary formulation to one that will take over Lyra's thoughts in The Secret Commonwealth, and that Pan will be fighting against throughout that book and its sequel, The Rosefield, that nothing is more than what it is, something like that. A phrase that Lyra has read in a book that she keeps rereading, The Hyperchorasmians, which, as Pastor David Nixon pointed out in our conversation just a few days ago, is essentially a retelling of the story of his Dark Materials. So, again, the germ of all of this, I think, is here, where Pullman proposes a theory of reading that everything means something, everything has a meaning, and we have to learn how to read it. To which he then opposes the antithesis that nothing has any meaning, or that everything means just one thing, just what it is. Nothing is more or less than that. That metaphor, imagination are figments of our imagination, if that's not too circular. Between this thesis and antithesis arises the dialectic of the Book of Dust, in my opinion. The idea, again, that we have a duty to find out how to read is also implicit there. The idea that reading can be for enjoyment seems a little bit left out of the equation, but then you look at the description and it's beautiful, fascinating, wonderful to say out loud, wonderful to contemplate, wonderful to see with one's mind's eye or one's physical eye. It is clear that this image is exactly what it is. Pullman saw it and he wanted to tell a story about it. But it's also just as clear, I think, that the image carries with it the strong whiff of allegory, of metaphor, of symbolic significance. It's unmistakable that this means something, not just in terms of the physical biology of the birds, the air, the chemistry, the physics, but in terms of our connection to it, what it conjures up for us. How can matter fold in that way? Is it really only 3-dimensional, or are there more dimensions somewhere in there? It's a kind of mathematical thought experiment that this raises. And mathematics, too, is of crucial importance, both in terms of the imaginary numbers that Lord Asriel uses as a kind of metaphor for what happens in history and in myth in the Garden of Eden story, as it's told in their book of Genesis. And, of course, in the good numbers, the beings that Lyra is in communication with, albeit very briefly, in the Book of Dust, these beings that exist between the good numbers. And the wonderful character of Abdel Ionides, her guide, and her sorcier particulier, her private sorcerer. So there's also a ton of math and imagery in the, I suppose, what we could call the literal Book of Dust that Malcolm steals from Gerard Bonneville, his notes towards a theory or methodology of something, basically explaining the discovery of dust as the particle associated with the Rusakov field. And again, we see a kind of evolution of that idea to where we become less interested in the particles of dust and more interested in the field itself. Rusakov particles, Rusakov field, rose field is kind of the direction that we're going there. Anyway, there's also this fascinating just grammatical moment here where what was a narrator's description at the start, and he says thousands, is picked up directly by Pantalaimon, who says millions. So we're pretty close to Lyra's own thoughts, because Pan is quite close to her own thoughts as well. They have a quasi-telepathic connection. But I think it's also plain here that we're seeing the characters in the story commenting on their narrator's telling of their story, which again I find fascinating. One big question that I have about the Book of Dust is whether that narrator is the same as the narrator in his Dark Materials. I tend to think not really, for a number of reasons. But one theory that I have is that the narrator in in his Dark Materials is actually closer to Will than to Lyra. And that in some places it seems almost as if Will could be the one writing the story looking back many years later. Almost as if. Whereas the Book of Dust, I think, is pretty clearly more connected with Lyra and actually might be a book that she is writing later on. At any rate, the last image we see is of her and Bonneville's son, Olivier, collaboratively confabulating, telling a story together. So she becomes that storyteller. So we see that process really starting here, I think, that transition from a story whose narrator is more like Will to a story whose narrator is more like Lyra. That's again just a theory that I'm sort of playing with, but I think there's evidence for it. So let's look again here. We have a kind of question that is arising here about what the meaning of the birds is. So first of all, do they have a meaning? But then, supposing that they do have a meaning, what is it? What could it be? What are the possibilities? And this is the task of the history of ideas, of experimental theology. There are ways of answering that question in Lyra's world that in some ways are more accurate than any we have access to, because she, of course, is learning to read the alethiometer. That was where we left her at the Ember Spyglass's close. If she's going to return to the garden, if she's going to recapture Eden, if she's going to build the Republic of Heaven, if she's going to have a story to tell the Harpies in the land of the dead when she goes there, if she's going to maintain her connection to Will through the imagination, the only way that they can cross the boundaries between worlds when the windows have all been closed, then all of this comes back to this question of how can they understand the movement of these particular birds? And so the fact that she's the one who insists that it does have a meaning, while Pan is asking the question, well then what is the meaning, shows that she is still not the Lyra of the Book of Dust, who has begun to question very skeptically, very cynically, very melancholically whether things have a meaning at all, whether the imagination has a purpose. But I just don't think that the Book of Dust uh, does enough to help us with what that meaning is. Um, I don't mind it so much if this story, which is barely 50 pages long, and they're very small pages, if this doesn't come to a totally satisfying place with that question. In some ways, I think the place this story comes to is more satisfying than the one that we get after the 1,000, 1,500, whatever pages of the Book of Dust. But there is, I think, in this miraculous, multi-dimensional cloth, maybe a pun buried, because the word text, textus, in Latin, means web or cloth. Anyway, something woven. This is a tidbit that I picked up from Kristen Poole. But as for the meaning of what the birds are doing, it quickly changes because it becomes clear that they are attacking something. They have uttered a mindless shriek. So whatever the meaning is, it's not like a human mind. Of course, their plural nature, their group individual status already suggested that there's something radically different about the kind of story that they are telling. But at any rate, their violence is something that inspires Lyra and Pan very quickly to act. They can respond to that. They attract the attention of this demon, it turns out, that the birds are attacking. They get it to come over to them where it can be safe. And they allow it to fall through a trap door so that the birds disperse and don't kill it or hurt it anymore. This is described as a blizzard of black snow, the swirling of the birds as they almost catch the witch's demon. And the aggression of these birds, again, we might think of the Tuolapi in the world of the Mlefa. We might think of the harpies themselves raking at Lyra in the world of the dead before she pacifies them with true stories. And this is also the point at which we get introduced to the character who, in a way, takes the place of Will in the Book of Dust, but in other ways doesn't, mercifully for many readers. And this is Dr. Polstead. So Malcolm Polstead is the main character in La Belle Sauvage, and then he remains an important secondary character in the subsequent 2 volumes. Here he is characterized as a young scholar, one who can climb the stairs, one who has visitors, and she can hear their voices faintly in his rooms. She knows that they can't be students because it's not term time yet, so it's not a tutorial that's going on. We never find out what it is that's going on, but I think we have some good theories that we might throw out, that he's actually having a meeting relating to Oakley Street or something along those lines, possibly even seeing Alice, who becomes Mrs. Lonsdale chronologically, who was already Mrs. Lonsdale in terms of the narrative sequence of when Pullman wrote about these characters. And she is, again, one of the great, wonderful characters who will reappear in the Book of Dust. So we don't know who they are, but we do know that Lyra has a big problem. She needs him not to find her talking to this demon. She needs to distract him by showing him what's happened to her books. They've been bespattered by the birds overhead, and so by showing him that, reasonably big problem, she distracts him from the much bigger problem, the demon without its witch. She, of course, cannot know that this is massively ironic because Dr. Polstead himself, like her, is able to separate from his demon because he saved her life when she was a baby and saved Alice's life perhaps as well. So the question that I always ask is arising here as well. Uh, when is this taking place? Right? It's not term time. When is it? Presumably, it's still the summer, I guess, around the time that she would be going to sit on the bench in the Botanic Garden. Um, Although whether she's just done that or whether she's about to do that, it's a little bit unclear. My bet is that it's a little bit after that. This also would be around the time of her birthday, if we're counting correctly. 6 months bring us to February sometime. We're approaching a birthday for Lyra. How old is she? We don't really know. We're told that she did spend a very difficult time with Dr. Polstead as her tutor um, a couple of years before. So that would have been right before or right after her experiences in his Dark Materials. I think it must have been just before, because well, it could have been either. I don't know, because she remains, I guess, a difficult student, and and she still has some problems with Dr. Polstead. This is couched in terms of how she is just polite to him, whereas he is friendly to her. Again, there's a story there. We learn it in La Belle Sauvage. But what exactly happened between them when he was tutoring her is so ambiguous that it's going to be raised later as an accusation against him. Perhaps this very moment is the one that is being referenced when she was seen leaving his rooms, straightening her clothes, or vice versa. Anyway, I don't remember. Um, and that is, of course, why many readers share her sort of distant um, admiration at best for Malcolm once he's older. The thought of them getting back together uh, is is a a massive disappointment, to say the least, for readers who have uh, seen her and Will's relationship blossom, seen Malcolm and Alice's complex love affair off and on again, um, and then particularly know that he was devoted to her when she was just a baby. There's to say nothing of the obvious superficial problem here of the power differential, the age differential, the teacher-student relationship, which that would violate. All right, but to come back to the real problem of the plot here, which is, what is this demon doing? Well, it's very frightened. It's cooped up in a bag, but it must stay there as a living burden while she gets it somewhere that it will be safer. It tries to tell her right out of the gate, you must guide me to this particular person, Sebastian Makepeace. So we get a name. The name Sebastian is a pretty interesting one, because in terms of art history, this is the saint who's often portrayed tied up, sometimes to a column or something, and riddled with arrows. So the idea of the starlings are darting around, right? That image of the dart is one you can trace through all of Pullman's works, and so the darts, the arrows, um, striking Saint Sebastian. That's my theory about where the name comes from. Um, as for Makepeace, it is pointed out in Poole that this is the name of the great Victorian, I guess, novelist, maybe just after, Thackeray. Uh, I I've never read any of his books, so I can't really comment more on that. But I do see the irony that another character will point out a bit later. Just we'll get there in a minute, I guess. Um, about his name being Makepeace when he was embroiled in some sort of controversy around manslaughter, possibly. We don't ever find out more details about that. The name of the demon is Ragi. The name of his witch, Yelena Pajets. I haven't looked that one up, but Helen of Troy, that's kind of my best guess there. It has northern. It has Russian feels to it. This witch is not one of the uh, Serafina Pekkala clan, but they are close enough that they have what they call the Birch Oath together. This is rather a clan further east in the Ural Mountains. Um, and actually, it's interesting that Lyra herself will tell a version of this same lie, because it becomes clear this is a lie, when she takes on the persona of Queen Tatiana, um, and calls herself a witch, um, in the Secret Commonwealth. One little detail that I would add here, um, the idea that she's going to leave this window open for the bird to fly in and out. Um, Again, is Pullman already thinking there must be something more to do with those windows? I can't just have them all closed. Maybe we should leave some open, right? So, in this point in the story, as they're talking about whether the demon can tell time, can read clocks, um, uh, just there, we have the interruption of the first of these objects from another world, if we don't count the epigraph itself, although probably we should, and the list given in the foreword, which again, sort of by the narrator, but not exactly. It's much more close to Pullman himself. Then what we get next, about a third of the way through the story, is the Globetrotter. There is so much about this little object that we could say, so I will just try to be brief here. First of all, my personal feeling about maps, I love maps. My father worked as a map maker, a cartographer, and a maker of naval charts for a long time. And so I grew up with maps all around and with a fascination, from reading fantasy stories, of course, with the worlds, not only our own world, but the worlds that are conjured by maps. Tolkien's maps in his books. The fact that there isn't a map for his Dark Materials always sort of stuck out to me. And so here we finally get one, but there's more with it, of course. It's not just the map itself, it's the list of all the maps, which tell us the names of all these places in Lyra's world. It's these pull quotes from characters who sound kind of like Will Perry's father or Pullman's own father, these sort of grand, majestic explorers from that age of empire with all its problems, with all its orientalizing, which we also get in the names of some of these places here. Their spellings, their locations, the kind of pricing that we have here, and the description, the copy is just lovely. Drawn with the greatest precision from notes, scientific observations, and instrumental readings taken during the most recent and accurate surveys, noted for their precision of detail and clarity of presentation. Pullman talks about going into the library and finding these old objects, these old maps, and looking at those. And I take it that he stole this or some phrase very like it from one of those bits of his research. We unfold it once, and we get two new things connected with the map. We get a selection of catalogs offering articles of great use to the traveler. Again, traveler with two L's, the British spelling. I love it. What do we see? A tent, like the ones that she would have stayed in when traveling with Egyptians in the north. A coat, like the one that the man in the photograph that Azrael projected back at the start would have been wearing. And he's kind of got his little walking stick, and he's kind of got his hip thrust out. It's lovely. Northrop's catalog. Is that Northrop Frye? I don't know. With a spyglass and a canvas bag there. Or maybe it's a bedroll, I'm not sure. Theophrastus Colcroft and Sons, sextants, theodolites, compasses, measuring chains, and it goes on. So the image of someone writing or drafting, creating a map right? So the creation of the map in the map, just like the creation of the story in the story. I love it. There is a set of compasses, compass needles, that is, not needles, but the measuring kind of compass, which of course was Pullman's original idea for a title for his book, The Golden Compasses, right? The ones held by Blake's Ancient of Days in that famous print. Those are from H.D. Armitage. And then Upchurch and Polk's Catalog of Ships, Chandlery, and Navigational Equipment. And there we have a compass, a traditional look at this to find your direction sort of compass. All the above catalogs may be had on application to Smith & Strange, Globetrotter House, Beaumont Street, Oxford. And so the joke there, of course, is that David Fickling, his publisher, is on Beaumont Street in Oxford. Then we get the list of books on travel, archaeology, and related subjects. Again, published by the same. These are full of little Easter eggs, I dare say. Every single one. Zeppelin to the Pole. The Proto-Fisher People of Lansall Meadows by Leonard Broken Arrow. So he's a character that we meet, or see anyway, when Lyra's with Mrs. Coulter. And the Proto-Fisher People, I'm pretty sure, are the ones that she's going to research in the story Serpentine, that is written just after this, or just around the same time, but published a bit later as one of the companion books. Star maps of the Yenisei region, the Yenisei where Stanislaus Grumman, a.k.a. Joe Perry, a.k.a. John Perry, was. Where the Reindeer Runs, Songs and Ballads of the Lap Kingdoms, these things that inspired Pullman. His story, Clockwork, includes a song about the flowers of Lapland. With Gun and Rod in the Hindu Kush, I mean, that's straight out of Kipling, right? A phrase book for the Levant, a phrase book for the Nordic lands, a phrase book for the Oceanic islands, all by James Verity. The same guy wrote all these language books. I mean, marvelous. A Guide for the Traveler in the Realms of the Witches by Carol Powers. I'd be fascinated to read more about the witches. I wish there was more of the witches in the Book of Dust. The Bronze Clocks of Benin by Marissa Coulter. So there's a book by Lyra's mother. And that's where I guess she got the technology of the spy flies. As Farder Coram says, she's traveled in many lands, not just in the north. Treatise on the Use of the Sextant by Giovanni Battista Kramer. The Lamassaries of Bhutan by Jasper Wetzel. Maybe we remember, maybe not, that one thing Farder Coram also talks about is the pools of ink used by the Hindus. We certainly will remember the I Ching. So again, the Far East. We never quite get there with the Book of Dust. Although we are up in the Himalayas somehow, magically, with Mrs. Coulter in the Amber Spyglass. Optical phenomena among the glaciers of the Alps. So again, this idea of seeing, a vision of what can be captured with photography. Core to Pullman's stories. Some curious anomalies in the mathematics of Palladio's Quattro Libri by Nicholas Outram. Those are Pullman's middle names. And again, I think he's more interested in math than even Kristen Poole, with all respect, seems to think. Polymathestatos, a festschrift in honor of Jocelyn Godwin by Athanasius Kircher, editor. This is a joke which she does explain very beautifully. Apparently there is a real person, this Godwin, who has written about Kirchner's very obscure yet strangely famous book about the dream of love and strife in a dream or something. I can't say the Latin name, or is it Greek? I don't know. But anyway, so the joke here is that author, Kirchner, has written a Festschrift, a series of, or collected rather, a series of essays in honor of this real-life, living scholar. The Prisoner of the Bears by Dr. Centellia. And Fraud, an Exposure of Scientific Imposture by Professor Trelawney. So the scholar that Lyra meets in the prison of the bears, and the I forget his job title. Anyway, the professor that we hear in Asriel's audience in the very start of the book get to have their scientific feud. It's just delightful stuff. And then we unfold the map the rest of the way. All right, and so we finally have it all unfolded, and we can see that on the back there is something that looks a lot like what's on the back of the book, a zoomed out picture, but this one includes the Cotswolds, the Vale of White Horse, and the Chiltern Hills, as well as a scale. On the front, we have the city of Oxford, particularly the colleges. It is Oxford by train, river, and zeppelin, published as the Act directs. There's a little detail there. It looks like Lyra herself riding the Egyptian boat, maybe a Giorgio Bramante's boat or something, and the demon up front. There's also this image of the roses, and the roses are going to become important. They were the name that Pullman originally had in mind for the title of this story, but he crossed it out in his manuscript. These roses are a lot like the ones that he drew for the final illustration of his own illustrations that I guess is in some editions of the Amber Spyglass. Those two roses are intertwined. These two roses are leaning towards one another, but there's a world, a globe, in between them. They do not touch. And these two roses have thorns, where those flowers did not. Again, the horses, the birds, the train, the Egyptian narrowboats, all these little details, what looks like a fox, a reindeer maybe, or a deer anyway with antlers, a bunny rabbit, a goat, jumping, leaping all around, but birds everywhere. And the Botanic Gardens gets a really big image. We can see the bench where Lyra and Will would go to sit. We also see a few locations pointed out on the map itself. St. Barnabas the Chemist by Juxon Street with the houses, the Eagle Iron Works, the Radcliffe Observatory, and the Felt Press. We see the Ashmolean Museum, where Lyra saw so someone who should have been familiar to her, but she couldn't quite place it. It turns out to be Lord Boreal. Then there's also the colleges, a few of them anyway. St. Sophia's, where she's now a student, and there's a pie on the windowsill there. Jordan College, Exeter in our world, is quite central, of course. That's where Pullman attended, and Magdalen as well, C.S. Lewis's college. The list of places I think would be interesting to go through. I don't know if all of these are real colleges except for Jordan, replacing Exeter. I just don't know enough. I would have to talk to somebody who did. Or I'd have to spend a lot more time sort of thinking about this than I already have. But what I will note is that we have some handwriting on here. And the handwriting is in a kind of gold or bronze colored pencil or ink, I suppose. The handwriting is meant to be Lyra's own, although I think it's actually David Fickling's. I'm not so sure about that. It might also be, again, the designer Heidi Lightfoot or the engraver John Lawrence, but I think it's David Fickling. And it's meant to be Lyra's own, I think. It points out Sunderland Avenue and the hornbeam trees associated with Will. Mary Malone lives here, an arrow to Norham Gardens. University Museum in Pitt Rivers. I said Ashmolean, but I guess it was the Pitt Rivers Museum where she saw Lord Boreal, wasn't it? Doesn't something happen at the Ashmolean in the story? I can't remember. And then one more note here to Sir Charles Latram's house. Um, that is Lord Boreal. So I think that image, um, really for me is the heart of this whole story. Um, Again, Lyra writing her own um, memories, right? Her version of the events in the form of these notes on this object from her world, which somehow has found its way to ours. I take that to be the seed of the Book of Dust in terms of its narration. Um, so it's humorous, there's jokes, there's a close connection because Pullman himself talks about how he has a kind of talismanic belief in the power of particular colors, and he uses them for what he's writing to organize and to protect his writing. And his color that he chose for this was that bronze color, or that's how I choose to interpret the use of that color pencil. Um, Again, just to say a little bit more about Polymethestatos, a festschrift in honor of Jocelyn Godwin, edited by Athanasius Kircher. This is from Poole. This purported festschrift, an academic genre of collected essays honoring an esteemed colleague, is for a real person, the polymath musicologist Jocelyn Godwin, who has written on important 17th century esoteric and scientific thinkers such as Robert Fludd and Athanasius Kircher. Pullman's joke here is to have the tables turned, with the long dead Kircher editing a collection on Godwin. Again, she goes on elsewhere. A keystone of the 17th century worldview is articulated by the Regius Professor of Cosmology at the University of Gloucester, with whom Lyra shares a prison cell in the palace of the usurper bear king Iofur Raknison. The professor declares, quote, "There is a correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm. The stars are alive, child. Did you know that? Everything out there is alive, and there are grand purposes abroad. The universe is full of intentions, you know. Everything happens for a purpose." She cites Northern Lights, page 328. The professor might be mad as a hatter, but the notion of an essential correspondence of the macrocosm, the larger cosmos, with the microcosm, the human body, was foundational for 17th century medicine and philosophy. And that's just really high-level interpretive historical scholarly work from Kristen Poole. 10 out of 10. And then we have Margaret Keane, another wonderful scholar who's given talks on Pullman's work, and particularly I would draw your attention to the interview she does about Lyra's Oxford. It takes place in the Bodleian Library Masterclass series. So apparently they couldn't get the technology working for him to be able to show or project some of the things that he brought with him, including manuscripts and things. But the audio is fine as far as Pullman's voice is concerned, and we mostly hear what Margaret Keane says. It's very difficult to hear other speakers in the audience, and that includes Heidi Lightfoot. I think John Lawrence is there, definitely David Fickling, the publisher and editor. And there's a lot of notes that I have about that, which I will spare you for now, I think, because this is already running very, very long. I apologize. So we'll put that in its own discussion. So the last thing I'll say about the map is just that it is glued into a page of the book. So in some way, it's a page that unfolds to be many pages. This is just making literal what every single page of Pullman's writing, of poetry, particularly of great stories, is able to do. Every time you look at it, it unfolds, and you can find more, and you can see more, and it changes how you see the real world as well. It teaches you about yourself, not least. And one thing about me is that I will never peel off that map willingly. Maybe it'll get ripped eventually, but there could be something on that last corner that is unfolded that is actually stuck to the page. Maybe there's something there. I'll never know. I'll never be able to tell because I'll never peel the map off to try to find out. And I always worry, I always wonder if in giving all these commentaries and reflections, what I'm doing is in some way peeling that page apart so much that, like the scholars in Shitagazhi, I cut through the last smallest bond between things and release something terrible, the specters, right? The the atomic explosion, you know, there is something about dissecting the butterfly that kills it. And I never want to do that. I never want to be the cause of that for anyone. I just want to invite and to model what I take to be the process of reading, the duty of readers, um, and certainly the thing that this book inspires me to do, which is to unfold and to talk about what I see and to ask what it means, and attempt to come to an answer. I have tentative answers that I'm coming to, and I just feel compelled to share them. But I never want to tear it, to rip it in that way. Okay, so picking up where we left off in the story, the demon responds that they learned how to read clocks and tell time at Trollesund, that threshold to the north of Lyra's world. We'll revisit it in Serpentine. It's where the witch console, Dr. Lancelius, lives. We have a mention here that Lyra is promising to take the demon to Mr. Makepeace. So she doesn't know who that is or where he is, but she's going to find out. And so she goes to the porter and asks if she can see a directory of Oxford. We don't get that object in here, but of course that would be a real thing, I suppose. Maybe there is a real Makepeace. And the porter's name is given, Shooter. It's the same person who was present in chapter 1 of the Golden Compass, the decanter of Tokai, who knocked it off of the table or was framed for doing so when Azrael needed to dispose of the wine, which was poisoned by the master, as Lyra told him. So that character is still here. And he does have the directory. And we get a bit of a shortcut here because as Lyra's looking into this, she hears a cheery voice. "Are you after the alchemist, Lyra?" And Dr. Polstead's ginger face leaned out of the porter's window, beaming at her curiously. So, knowing more than he appears, Dr. Polstead, he knows of this Makepeace, the alchemist. His ginger face, his ginger cat demon, is not present there, I think. But he's fumbling with some papers. Maybe they're code, who knows. He says, "He used to be a scholar of Merton till he went mad. Don't know how they managed to tell in that place. He devoted himself to alchemy in this day and age. Spends his time turning lead into gold, or trying to. You can see him in Bodley sometimes. Talks to himself. They have to put him outside, but he goes mildly enough. Demon's a black cat. What are you after him for?" All right, and so she finds his name in the directory. His house is in Juxon Street. And she gives a lie here. She lies fluently still, that what she wants is to make some toffee. She said that there was a Makepeace, a William Makepeace, who used to make treacle toffee better than anyone. This is something that her tutor, Miss Parker, said. And then she goes on, she's not dull like most teachers. So she's just spinning a little yarn. But I do think there's something to this. When she lies, she does so by becoming more effeminate, becoming more girly, saying she'll make some toffee herself, maybe. Whereas Polstead, Malcolm, is very earnest. He's trying to help, but he doesn't let on all that he knows either. Presumably, he, knowing what he does about the world that they're in, this world that includes the secret commonwealth, would not be so dismissive of the work of an alchemist. But there you go. The black cat demon, the madness of the scholar, this is all evocative, of course. This is where we get the note about his difficulty teaching her 2 or 3 years before. So I think that puts us just before her adventure based on some other time points that we get elsewhere in the story here. All right, so a change of scene. Lyra goes back to her dining hall, where it's good manners not to sit with the same people all the time. So she sort of, by happenstance, finds herself by a historian, Greenwood, who answers her questions, how experimental theology has replaced alchemy. because it has a superior conceptual framework to it. Chemistry is more explanatory and parsimonious than alchemy. This happened about 250 years ago, which puts us in the 17th century. And yet there are those on the eccentric fringes of scholarship, as she says, a bit cracked, who think they have the key to the cosmos, right? We should think about this scholar that we just heard quoted. It's a bit tragic, she says. Tragic and comic, right? Because what appears to be fringe very often is a not yet understood way to get back to the center. So we have a gentle critique, I think, of her version of history and of science, the history of science. Um, she has a marmoset demon. I think that that's the same as um, Dr. Relf's. This is a kind of version of Dr. Relf almost. And we never see her again, as far as I know. Nor do we see this friend of Lyra's, Ruth, unless I'm forgetting her brief appearance in the Secret Commonwealth, maybe. But very sadly, she can't convince Lyra to go to see this this flute player, flautist, Michael Koch, perform. The protagonist of Galatea, Pullman's novel, is also a flute player. I can't remember his name. Anyway, is it a Matthew? Or am I thinking of the Haunted Storm? Anyway, so what she tells Ruth is a different lie, not about treacle, but about Latin. She has to go work on her Latin. And it's true in a way because she will come up with this idea about meanings of words towards the end of the story. So we come along to the journey to Juxon Street. And this is a series of real places, as far as I can tell, that we could probably track if we were in Oxford. No doubt tour guides and such have tracked it, and I hope to go on that walk someday. We pass the Radcliffe Camera, down alley, across Brasenose. All this time she's using her witch-like powers of separation to mislead any people trying to track her. She tells Pan to hush more than once as they go across Broad Street, through the Corn Market, St. Giles. A bookshop is noted on a corner. It might be the same one where Will, or rather where Lyra saw some initials carved. I don't know. I might be getting that place mixed up as well. And they're asking themselves why they're suspicious. Is it because alchemy is nonsense? Well, that's part of it, but it does seem like there's something more to this. And again, the truth of alchemy mirrors the truth, or lack thereof, of this story that the demon has told them. He says that they need an elixir, and that he was told this by Lancelius himself. Now, Lyra mentions overhearing a secret from Dr. Lancelius, and this is a piece of the story of his Dark Materials that is especially pliable and flexible and foldy, and that takes a lot of unfolding because it's kind of a retroactive change that Pullman makes, a retcon, where we do see her in Trollesund while she has the task of sorting these cloud pine branches. The consul was talking to Fardacorum, and she says this later in Amber Spyglass, and they didn't know I could hear him. He said the witches had this prophecy about me. I was going to do something great and important, and it was going to be in another world. Only I never spoke of it, and I reckon I must have even forgot it. There was so much else going on. So it sort of sunk out of my mind. I never even talked about it with Pan, which is ominous, given the whole problem of the Book of Dust is her relationship with Pan fraying. Dr. Lancelius, the council said it was vital I never found out what my destiny was till it happened, see. I must never ask about it, so I never did. I never even thought what it might be. I never asked the alethiometer even. But now I think I know, and finding you again," she's talking to Roger's ghost, "is just a sort of proof. What I got to do, Roger, what my destiny is I got to help all the ghosts out of the land of the dead forever. Me and Will, we got to rescue you all. I'm sure it's that. It must be. And because, Lord Asriel, because of something my father said, death is going to die." So she's pieced together from these fragments of story a compelling narrative for her, a compelling account of her destiny. It's never confirmed that that was the prophecy exactly, although the prophecy is alluded to and talked about. And the fact that she overheard it almost implies that the prophecy can't be that, because she can't know what she's doing. And so if she is successful, which it does appear that she is, in rescuing the worlds, all the worlds, from the flight of dust, from the evacuation of meaning, then she must not have it quite right in terms of her narrative here. Or the prophecy includes its own contradiction, which is a very Keatsian negative capability thing to think about. But like I say, endless amounts of folding and unfolding, of contradiction, of paradox, are kind of bound up here, including the way in which the story, as we're told it in the Golden Compass, is different from the story that we're told in the Amber Spyglass. And of course, another big retcon is the whole purpose of Asriel that he tells to Marissa Coulter at the end of the one book as opposed to towards the end of the other. A whole thing. So why was it momentous? Why was her being there and overhearing that secret momentous? Well, because it gives rise to this endless process of interpretation. Was she right? Was she wrong? Was she morally right? Is our reading of this book a moral duty, or is it moral for us to not read it because it's dangerous? Right? So these kinds of questions arise. It's incredibly open-ended. And I think that this phrase, death is going to die, as well as being an allusion more or less directly to John Donne in his poem, is an allusion to, I think somewhere in the Paul, in the letters of Paul, the epistles. He says something very similar about, of course, in his telling, the Messiah is Jesus and not Lyra. But Lyra in this telling is the new Eve. That's the name the witches have for her, which explains her destiny. And so we come back to this problem of the presence or absence of meaning, the presence or absence of what I take to be the meaning of the story that I'm a part of, which is the character, the person of Jesus. And his absence in the Book of Dust is crucial, and I think is a crucial failure on the part of Pullman. He claims that he puts that story into The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ and deals with it there, and I don't find that compelling at all. But again, story for another time. Okay, so the idea that the witches don't have a remedy for this mysterious ailment, the demon sort of explains that, yeah, they have their own remedies. We know about blood moss, we know about their healing spells, and we know that those aren't always totally effective in all cases. But this is something that needs the gold elixir. It's a sickness from the south. And in this sickness, the demon doesn't die, but the person does. This is almost the reverse of the end of the Book of Dust, where we see demons dying and their people living. Again, we have the allusion to a time here, that it's 2 years before the events of this story that she had her heart bruised. And so now she's incredibly tender. So 2 or 3 years means slightly before, then the events of his Dark Materials, then this story. I'm quite sure, although not entirely, that the Polstead stuff should have happened before the events of his Dark Materials. The only reason that we aren't told about Dr. Polstead there is because Pullman himself didn't know that that was a character. And so if we were going to retcon some things, that would be one to maybe think about. But again, perhaps some of this vagueness about time is intentional as well. And we'll just have to think about that. So the explanation for why Lyra is taken in by this lie of the demon is partly at least due to her tenderness in her heart, the fact that she is still grieving the loss of Will. Um, this is something that we really don't see very much of in the Book of Dust, and I can't see that as anything other than another failure of the story and another uh, lack of paying off certain debts that are accrued through the previous stories on the narrator's part. The lack of delivering on certain promises that are, if not directly made, then implied. Um, so when we get the image here of the thoughts passing across her face, it's one that we have heard something like before. Um, so they have the theory that the two are lovers, make peace in the witch, which is correct. It's borne out. Um, they have this thought that part of the problem with the demon story is that it's an alchemist they're looking for when they think that alchemy is nonsense, which we will sort of see as the whole point. We have the hint of truth in in the fact that Dr. Lancelius's name is dropped and Seraphina Pecola's name is dropped, and so those are uh, people that we know about. Um, um, the distress. Oh, okay, yeah, it is right here. It's not far now. She moved on quickly, with Pan leaping ahead. A dozen troubling thoughts were passing over her mind like cloud shadows swiftly skimming over a cornfield on a breezy day, but there wasn't time to hold them back and examine them because already they were turning down Little Clarendon Street, that row of fashionable dress shops and cafes, chic cafes, where the gilded youth of Lyra's Oxford passed the time, and then right into Walton Street, with the great classical bulk of the Felt Press on the left. They were in Jericho now. But you notice the caesura, the pause in the middle of that long, wonderful sentence, is interrupted by the appearance of a torn page from Baedeker's Coasts of Bohemia, his travel book for Lyra's world, and for the Jericho specifically of Lyra's Oxford. Juxon Street is the heading here, and then City Museum for the next page. This is page 12 and 13. A dozen troubling thoughts, page 12. Probably not a total accident or coincidence. And the number 12, of course, highly relevant to someone steeped in the biblical worldview, as Pullman is. Tolkien too, but Pullman in this case. But the image of the cloud shadows, I think, deserves some attention. It's one that we get many times throughout Pullman's books. Just a few passages that I was able to find here in his Dark Materials in chapter 8 of the first book. Pantalaimon would crouch over the dial, sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a mouse, swinging his head round after the needle, and once or twice the two of them shared a glimpse of meaning that felt as if a shaft of sunlight had struck through clouds to light up a majestic line of great hills in the distance, something far beyond, and never suspected. And Lyra thrilled at those times with the same deep thrill she'd felt all her life on hearing the word north. We have a passage in La Belle Sauvage, page 422, where Malcolm is watching Alice. Expressions flitted over Alice's face like the shadows of swift clouds on an April morning, but these expressions were all fear, or disgust, or horror, and looking at her, Malcolm felt he would never see sunlight on a spring morning again, so deep was the anguish and loathing the girl was feeling. So that's chilling, quite horrible, really. And then in The Secret Commonwealth, in its opening chapter, we see on page 14 one of the few mentions of Will, and it comes in the sentence, her cheeks were flushed. This is Pan looking at Lyra's sleeping face. Her cheeks were flushed. Her dark gold hair was damp. Those lips that had whispered to him often, had kissed him and kissed Will too, were compressed. A little frown hovered on her brow, coming and going like clouds in a windy sky. They all spoke of things that were not right. of a person who was becoming more and more unreachable to him as he was to her, and he had no idea what to do about it. These are always really significant passages, and I think that they have their origin here in a passage of, I have a feeling this all belongs to me. My mother was hanging out some washing on a sunny day and singing, as happy as a lark. The wind was chasing fat white clouds through the blue sky, and the sheets on the line billowed like the clouds, big, fresh-smelling, moist clouds that swelled and flapped and swung up high. The song my mother was singing filled the sheets and the clouds and the immense blue beaming sky, and I felt so light that I too might swing up and be blown along in the wild blue splendor. And she took me and swung me up high among the snow-white sheets and the billowing clouds and the wind and the song and the endless dazzling sky, and I shouted and sang for joy. 40 years later, when I was writing a book called The Broken Bridge, I wanted to give my character Ginny an image of perfect happiness, and nothing I'd experienced in all my life was better than the sheets and the clouds and the song and the bright blue morning. So I write about them in the same words that I've used here. So the process of writing the story calls up this memory and this evocation of the memory in a language which is appropriate to it and which is only discovered through the story. I think this is one of the ways in which Pullman's writing most approximates poetry, although he will frequently say that there's a distinction, and rightly so, between his prose and the great poets. I think he is closer to being among them than he is willing to let on. All right. Again, this page, this single page, front and back, has given rise to so many notes that I don't know. I don't know if this is even helpful at this point. But the first thing you'll notice, it's on a kind of old-looking paper, and this is mentioned in the talk at the library, how Heidi Lightfoot, the designer, went to some lengths to find, the right sort of paper, and it's got this little flap that Pullman points out, this little dog ear on the bottom corner, which you can see on both sides of the paper, right? Because they took one picture and then they used it for both, rather than turning it over, actually. and so it's the only paper in any universe, he says, or something like that. The only paper that is dog-eared on both sides. And again, there's that multi-dimensional cloth, that impossible mathematics, that paradox at work. It's a kind of Cittàgazze place, I think, here, the coasts of Bohemia, right? If we're going to have an Oxford that is somehow also overlapping with a Mediterranean city like Cittàgazze, the city of Will's dreams, then we may as well call it the coasts of Bohemia. It mentions some people, some of them real and some I think invented. Randolph Lucy doesn't seem to be a real person, but he was an alchemist in Lyra's world who lived on Juxon Street and was known for turning lead into gold, keeping spirits captive, for being killed by a witch. His eagle demon may have given rise to the name of the Eagle Iron Works, which is around the corner there, where they built cannons, including the Thunderer, used for the Baltic War of 1812, which is a lot like Rudyard Kipling's Kim sitting on the Zam Zama, means thunderer, in that book, or a lot like, again, the great novel, perhaps, War and Peace, which is all about the War of 1812, its precursors, its after effects. And the great overture by Tchaikovsky of 1812 includes the sound of cannon properly, and drums at least. We hear the canals mentioned and how the Egyptians are among them. The reference is made to how a boat from Roman times was discovered in one of the locks at Isis. It has allusions to the god Fluvius of the river, who demanded child sacrifice, evidently because there were skeletons found of children. The deaths of children, the sacrifice of children, is, of course, one of Dostoevsky, to quote another great Russian novelist, one of his strongest arguments that he gives to his character, Ivan Karamazov, in the great Grand Inquisitor sequence there in the Brothers Karamazov. It is part of the City Museum now. Maybe that's where I was thinking about the Ashmolean. We hear mention of Wolvercote and a battle there in the year 1005, where the Egyptians and the people of Oxford fought against the Vikings and were victorious, leading to the great and tight connection between their peoples. We hear about the horse fair, and we're given a date, the second week of July. Miraculous. This answers a question I had all the way back in the Golden Compass. When is the horse fair taking place? If it's the only horse fair in the year, presumably it's in the summer after all. Anyway, they say that small objects vanish from windowsills. Wonder if that'll be relevant towards the end of this book. And it's a remarkable fact that there are more babies born in April than any other time of the year. So, the timing of Lyra's birth gives us some idea about the whereabouts and activities of her parents. But of course, one of the major and most problematic twists that we get in the end of the Rose Field, spoilers, is that Azriel Azriel was not the first to seduce Marisa Coulter. Before she was Marisa Coulter, she was Marisa Van Zee or something like that. No, in fact, it was Bonneville who most likely raped her, and that she conceived and had Olivier Bonneville, that child. So that Lyra and Olivier are siblings, half-siblings. Anyway, the Fell Press is the next entry. Seems to be a stand-in for Oxford University Press, and we're given a fanciful founder, Joachim Fell, from Mainz, fleeing the persecutions there, which were very real, and a fictional hippie for the real 500 years of printing by S.H. Steinberg is cited here. So printing is one of Pullman's great fascinations, of course. The Temple of Mithras is cited. It is underground in the conclusion of the book, The Haunted Storm, which Pullman has distanced himself from, but not entirely gone off the record about, that we see a Mithraic temple as well. There's this character, Lolly Parsons, who runs a tavern. Sounds a lot like some of the characters we meet in the Sally Lockhart books. And when a plague pit is opened, we have a kind of sickness, a real one, right, historical one, to echo the fake one that the demon has been telling us about. But there is a plague that carries off Fardacorum and Seraphina Pecola's child, very sadly. We haven't gotten that story yet. We hear about Barnabas the chemist. Apparently there was a real architect, Arthur Blomfield, behind the church of St. Barnabas in our world and in Lyra's. There is a talk that Pullman gives inside the church, so you can see the interior, and that's with John Mayer and Mark Davies. This invented saint that we hear about here of 3rd century Palmyra was the perfumer to a Queen Zenobia, and the only thing we learn about him is that he was beheaded, and that's where the entry ends. So St. John the Baptist with his head on the platter. The allusion, though, to perfumes, of course, we might think about the roses that are so important in the Book of Dust. And Zenobia is the name of the cruise liner that is, the brochure is included here with some dates as well at the end of this book. So this is where the narrator picks up after the guidebook, and we see a pattern, I think, because we've seen that every 15 pages or so of the narrative is interrupted by a key item or material object. The map, the guidebook page, And then if we follow this forward, where we should get one at about page 45, instead, what we have is a quote that Lyra has already said. Um, Everything has a meaning if only we could read it. Now it's being stated by Makepeace himself. Does he somehow know that? Is he actually quoting her? Or is it just because that is the theme of the story and it is important that we have some sort of external verification outside of Lyra herself? Anyway, we don't get any more objects there. They're all held off for another couple pages. The story ends, and then we get Mary Malone's postcard, the cruise brochure, and a final little engraving of a bird. Okay, but we need to finish up this story. The description of Jackson Street and of Jericho by extension is again very evocative. We hear that beyond it is Port Meadow and the woods of Whiteham, and Lyra could hear the cry of some night bird out on the distant river. Again, they are trying to talk to her, and she sort of feels that. But she doesn't pick up on it entirely for various reasons. Instead, she's brought to the house. She quickly moves along because she can sense that something is wrong. She sees through the window into the basement that there's a fire burning. Or is it Pan who sees this? There's a witch and a man laying there, maybe dead. There's something wrong. And so her awareness is described like a naphtha lamp sprinkled with spirits. So it flares up, and she hears this high, wild scream. The witch is coming at her. It's a trap. She thinks of Will. Her inner monologue, the narrative, says the name Will 3 times in a row. The witch is described as having a mask of madness and hatred. And then Lyra sees the image of Will and of wanting to partake of his courage, the courage she imagines he would have in this situation. And this saves her in the form of a white swan, this shape that flies past her, knocks her to the ground, and crushes the witch herself, makes her back break like a broken lizard. And these real sparks this time. So again, the narrative, the metaphor, or the simile of the sparks from the fire of the naphtha lamp become real sparks of the knife of the witch scraping against the pavement. And then Lyra lifts the bird, right? Instead of touching the body of the witch, lifts the bird's body. It's awkward. Oh, we hear her voice. Oh, but she's able to just carry it far enough to the gleam below the pavement. Not the sparks on the pavement, but the water below, and to put the bird in. And so the bird is able to drift away with its kin. This brings us from very quickly through the climactic moments of the story, again, all having to do with Will and her connection with him and the bird's connection with her, with them, to this character who we've been searching for because of a lie, but nonetheless who's going to be of some importance. Less importance than I thought, but of some importance in the Book of Dust. And this, of course, is Sebastian Makepeace, the Alchemist. He's described as being in his 60s, as being dazed and having a ravaged face, having sooty-covered hands, but he is quite lucid, actually. He says, we have to move quickly. The street is going to wake up soon. So again, there's this idea of a kind of spell cast, an enchantment over the street. It's broken by the death of the witch. They go to his room, full of all these instruments covered in dust. Maybe they're Barnabas the chemist's own instruments. Who knows? And why? She asked, why was the witch lying? She thought she could trust witches. But of course, as he points out, they are people too. I wish we got more about witches in the new books. He tells briefly the reason why she was lying and why she tried to kill Lyra and him. That he indeed was her lover. They had a son, and their son went to serve in Azrael's ranks, fighting the authority and the forces arrayed against him. The son was killed in the battle, and the witch, when she found the son's body, found her own arrow through his heart, harsh. This is very much like the death of John Perry at the end of The Subtle Knife. The death of the father transposed to the death of the son. This is very close to the core fairy tale for Pullman in I Have a Feeling This All Belongs to Me of the juniper tree. The father eating his son. And he interprets that in a certain way, and I think there's other ways that we could interpret that story. But it's one that's very important to Tolkien as well. It's one that he cites as well. And so there's a really important through line there, a really important tension that I think we can spell out in another place. But again, the point could not be clearer here. It's almost spelled out too clearly that his father, Sebastian Makepeace, taught his son, who's not named, to cherish the things that Asriel stood for. And so the witch blamed him, right? She was on the side of the authority, and her clan was fighting Asriel's forces. She is on the wrong side. Their son and he were on the right side, Lyra's side. And of course, they also blamed Lyra because in some way the war was all fought over her. It's not to blame her, but she did want to punish not just Lyra, but also Makepeace himself. She framed Makepeace for Lyra's death in her plan. She had Lyra leave many clues, and now Lyra looks back over the course of the events and sees those clues very clearly. The trail, starting with Dr. Polstead and the porter and the historian and Ruth, all of these pointers that will lead the authorities straight to Sebastian Makepeace. Now the swan remains a mystery. Oh, why wasn't he killed or taken out by the poison, the drugs? She didn't want to kill him, sorry. But why wasn't he knocked out still? Well, he's developed an immunity to these drugs because of his researches. Again, alchemy has a purpose. It's a lot like the purpose of the character in The Princess Bride, perhaps, right? Who has an immunity to the poison of the Sicilian. Wesley's his name. And so she shouldn't feel bad. The witch has had 600 years to become so clever. Lyra's not stupid. But then this is turned around again because what does the swan represent? Well, nature, the world as a whole, and the consciousness of the world as a whole, having had millennia and eons longer than even the witches to hone its craft and its storytelling powers, right? On that length of timeline, our puny intelligence cannot hope to compete, right? But we can make microcosms of it in the form of these sorts of stories. Short stories, novels, epics, even myths, right, are in some way our version of reflecting that wider cosmic consciousness, perhaps. So what is the meaning of the birds, right? He quotes her own words back to her about everything having a meaning if only they could learn to read it. Well, the meaning has something to do with saving her, with protection, with overcoming the malice of the witch and her lies. It has something to do with learning to read that meaning and seeking, because he says, you will find the meaning if you seek it. Just as they're about to find the body. In fact, someone does find the body outside. They hear the street waking up. Finding the body is such a crucial piece of any of these sorts of stories. And I just can't help but feeling like what Pullman never wants to do, and yet comes too close to doing sometimes, is putting that body right in front of the reader so that we can't miss it. Sometimes he does cross the boundary from being a storyteller to being a preacher. And I think he even acknowledges this in places. Now, is what the alchemist doing? Turning lead into gold, or trying to? No, he says that would be foolish. That's impossible. We know it's not, of course, because in an infinity of possible worlds, all things are possible. But we also might be thinking of other literary alchemists, primarily Paulo Coelho and his book, The Alchemist, in which the transmuting of lead into gold does literally take place, but is again in service of a kind of metaphorical idea of a personal legend. The treasure being found in the place that you leave. those lines in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, right? To know it for the first time. It's again a powerful fairy tale motif. And as for what he's really doing, well, in some way, again, Lyra goes on this long journey, and she never does go back to talk to Sebastian Makepeace. And so he says, maybe we'll find out another time. That story has not yet been written, as far as I know, as far as my reading of the Book of Dust goes. Pan goes back and talks to him and learns important things. But what he is actually doing, and what the other alchemists that we encounter, like Cornelius Agrippa in Prague, what they're actually doing is left up to interpretation, right? So that's the thing I was asking for, I suppose, right? But I guess I just don't feel like the balance is quite there between the things that we are given and the things that are left ambiguous. Okay, so the denouement here. Going back through a gate that he shows her, going back along Walton Well Road, back to her window and climbing in, back to her Latin. There is the sound of a nightingale, very evocative bird, very important for invoking not just the reader of the alethiometer for Azrael's army, a Basilides, but the form that Will's demon takes before settling as a cat. When Pan is an owl, she's a nightingale. But very importantly also, the great Nightingale Ode of Keats. And so we could contrast this moment where she hears the nightingale's voice with the moment when she hears an owl in the Secret Commonwealth. From somewhere far off on the marshes came the cry of an owl. Lyra found herself thinking, what does that mean? Some years before in Oxford, she'd had an encounter with the demon of a witch in a little adventure that had culminated in her thinking that everything meant something, if only she could read it. The universe had seemed alive then. There were messages to be read everywhere you looked. Something like the cry of an owl out on the marshes would have been blazing with significance. But, of course, the whole problem in the Book of Dust is that she no longer feels that way. It's the way that Mary Malone is described as feeling as well. Even though she no longer believes in God, she still has that feeling of connection with the world, and she derives it through her work and through the stories that she tells and through her connections with other people. That disconnect for Lyra is, again, in some way addressed, filled with her connection with Bonneville, Olivier, that is, and with Pan by the very end, with her determination to continue telling stories. But whether that is actually an equivalent, actually getting back to the garden, right? I just don't know. I just don't know if it's possible without some honest and some coherent account of the source of meaning, which I take to be God. I don't see any other answer that's going to satisfy. Here's what they say in this book, though, when she hears the call of the nightingale. Somewhere in the dark trees a bird was singing. A nightingale, Lyra guessed, but they didn't know for certain. Maybe, Pan said. The meaning, you know. Yeah, as if the birds and the whole city protecting us. Could it be that? They stood still. Their city lay quietly around them, and the only voice was the birds, and they couldn't understand what it said. Things don't mean things as simply as that, Lyra said uncertainly, do they? Not like mensa means table. There's her Latin. They mean all kinds of things mixed up. But it feels like it, Pan said. It feels as if the whole city's looking after us. So what we feel is part of the meaning, isn't it? Yes, it is. It must be. Not the whole of it. And there's a lot more we don't even know is there, probably. Like all those meanings in the alethiometer, the ones we have to go deep down to find. Things you never suspect. But that's part of it, no question. The city, their city, Lyra's Oxford. Belonging was one of the meanings of that. And protection and home. Again, a kind of three-part description, mirroring the will earlier. Very shortly afterwards, as they climbed in through the pantry window with the loose latch, they found the remains of an apple pie on the marble worktop. We must be lucky, Pan, Lyra said, as they carried it upstairs. See, that's another thing it means. And before they went to bed, they put the crumbs out on the windowsill for the birds. And a beautiful final engraving image. Just, in some ways, the most perfect encapsulation of all of what Pullman is up to in these longer books, in this longer series as a whole, the two series which fit together as one. They're knit together, they're woven in with these little books, these companion books in between. And this is Lyra's Oxford, Lyra with Mensa, right? We have a table set for us. We have a pie, a serendipitous, a lucky find, and yet nothing happens without some reason. There's a providence in the fall of a sparrow, right? And the alethiometer is a part of it, right? Her search for meanings deep down in there, which she has to do consciously and not the way she used to, by grace, but by works. I think the connection of all of these things, right, with the allusions to Will, with allusions to Pullman's other works, I think I Was a Rat ends in a very similar way, actually. And in some ways, the end of The Rosefield is very similar to this. Those crumbs, isn't that something like the woman who responds to Jesus, responds to his parable with a parable, right? Even the dogs are allowed to eat from the crumbs of the master's table. And he responds positively. It's one of the very few moments in Matthew where he's interacting with a Gentile and not with the lost sheep of Israel. All of this is in some way packed in here so intricately, so masterfully. And yet, I just don't feel like the Book of Dust lives up to the promise of Lyra's Oxford, even for all of its great imagery, great development of the themes. I just feel like this little book does it better than the whole of the long trilogy that follows. That's my impression right now, having just read this one and having just read that one. But I am rereading it. I am still working through it. In his notes for his discussion with the Archbishop, Pullman talks about 2 or 3 times in his life, he says he has had intimations of this connectedness, this cosmic feeling. And for him, he also experiences melancholy and that feeling of disconnection from self that he portrays with Lyra. I think that we see both of those in his work. I think that we see both of them in the literature, in the poetry, and the myths that he is always drawing from in conversation with. Now he calls this a kind of bonbon, a little goodie, full of little goodies, right? A kind of jeu d'esprit, right? A kind of fun game, but there's also a seriousness to it. There's nothing more serious, I would say, than challenging the simple faith. Even to make it a more complex faith, it has to be done very carefully, or else we are cast into the sea with millstones. So that balance of fun and seriousness, of lightness and incredible gravity, I think, just to wrap up here, is carried off really well in this book, and particularly with these objects. So we get a postcard of Oxford, England, that has 4 elements to it. They are the Botanic Garden, and it's the bench in the Botanic Garden, the University Science Buildings, the hornbeam trees on Sunderland Ave, and some houses in Norham Gardens. And here's what is written here. Angela Gorman, 5 Leonards Road, Lancaster, England. Dear Angela, Tilda, just arrived in Oxford, Tilda. So strange not to be sister, unquotes, anymore. I thought you'd like this postcard, such a beautiful city. And they produce a card like this. But it does show the place I work in, and a house just around the corner from my flat. Tilda, that's something anyway. Lots of love, Tilda. Mary. I think those are meant to be dashes. I haven't looked this up, but let me do it right now. 5 Leonard's Road. Where's that? My theory is that this is um, maybe one of the nuns. It's called St. Leonard's House, Lancaster. Huh. So I was hoping that it would be. Maybe there is no Leonard's Road, is why it's giving me this other place. St. Leonard's House is a student dormitory at Leonard's Gate, just outside Oxford. Hmm. Yeah. Inconclusive. We never hear more about this Angela Gorman. She doesn't appear, as far as I can recall, in the Book of Dust. Um, which makes sense because nobody from our world, from Will's world and Mary Malone's world does. Um, but the postcard makes it to Lyra's world anyhow, or back to ours. I'm not entirely sure. I'm kind of losing track. Um, the last thing in here is the cruise brochure. Cruise by SS Zenobia to the Levant. A world of romance and sunshine, of silks and perfumes, of carpets and sweetmeats, of damascene swords, of the glint of beautiful eyes beneath the star-filled sky. Um, Now, they do find this in the very beginning of the Secret Commonwealth. On the body of the dead man is a key that takes them to a left luggage box, which has his luggage, and in it is this exact object: a 36-day cruise with all of the stops listed. In their world, it appears that this also includes the year, because Pan says it's this year. In our world, the year has been expunged or is missing for some reason, but the circled part is the same. And it's not in the same handwriting, or anyway, it's not Lyra's handwriting. But the stop in Smyrna takes place on Monday, May 11th. And during that stop, someone has circled it and written Cafe Antalya, Suleiman Square, 11 a.m. So there's going to be a meeting there. This is a way in which, as Pullman says, the future can affect the past, because it is that meeting which, in part at least, sets Lyra off on her journey, among other confluences of events. And while she doesn't ever have exactly that meeting, it is close to there that she encounters Bud Schlesinger, a kind of redux version of Lee Scoresby, this other wonderful character who, of course, doesn't appear in the new books because he's gone. But early in the book, when she reads the passage, "Thrilled to the whisper of moonlight on the tranquil waters of the Mediterranean," Lyra scoffs. How can moonlight whisper? And this is kind of, again, getting to the heart of what is the problem, the tension that sets off the story. And I think it's very difficult as readers not to also see this as a problem with the story. um, the the scoffing, this character of Lyra is so different from the Lyra that we have come to know and love from earlier books, including Lyra's Oxford. And it takes a lot of adjusting. So, again, a couple final quotes here about meaning. Well, in Galileo's understanding of natural philosophy, there is a grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. This is quoted in Goff, Galileo's Error. I think he is not entirely fair to Galileo, to put it lightly. I'm not entirely convinced that Pullman's Dust is all that like the panpsychism sketched by Goff. I might have to read more of Goff. I know he has a new book and he has a more technical book. But for me, I think there is actually a bit more to be said on Galileo's side here, as well as on Pullman's side. And I don't find Goff's arguments quite as convincing, perhaps, as Pullman himself does. I'm not sure. Um, and then just another quick passage. This is in The Secret Commonwealth. What does mean anyway? This is Asta and Malcolm. Well, that's easier. The meaning of something is its connection to something else, to us in particular. And this is Poole now. This idea that meaning only comes through interconnection and that we are at the heart of that meaning, that people and nature and the cosmos and the divine are interwoven, mutually linked, reverberating and resonating with each other, is the key to understanding so much of 17th century thought. The esoteric thinker Robert Flood attempted to visually portray this complex interconnectedness of, well, everything. And it goes on, and there's an image that looks a lot like, the alethiometer, the face of the alethiometer. We might also, again, think of Mary Malone in the Trees, of Pullman's experiences that he briefly touches on, but says they're almost too private to talk about. I'm sure that all of us, at least once we're of a certain age, have had those experiences, have reflected on those experiences, and wondered, is nature, the cosmos, the human, the divine, connected or separate? Is it only in our imagination that we can suppose and believe that these things are connected? Or are they really that? And that's where the source of our imagination ultimately lies. Again, I lean towards the latter. I think Poole does as well. I think Pullman, Goff are kind of in between somewhere. Not as far as a Feuerbach, say, who for whom all of our religious ideas are transcendent manifestations of very material things. Anyway, this has been a first in a series of little side quests into the little books of Philip Pullman. Next time, we will turn from Lyra's Oxford to Once Upon a Time in the North, and we will be looking at that character, that wonderful character, Lee Scoresby. But I do hope that something of what I've been saying over these long couple of hours is resonating with you and is helping to unfold some of the wonders of Pullman's writing. Thanks for listening. Until next time, take care.